Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Todd Eby. I'm the Project Review Manager at the Susquehanna River Basin Commission. We're going to get started with the Public Water Supply Assistance Webinar Series, Part 1, Groundwater Project Renewals, a two-step process. I just wanted to mention the participants' audio lines will be muted during the webinar. The chat box is available to submit questions at any time. And this session is being recorded so that we can make it available at a later time on our website. We're going to have Mike Appleby, the Supervisor of Groundwater, and Bill Miller, a reviewer in our project review section in the Groundwater group. They're going to be our presenters today, but before we get started, I'd like to just ask Andrew Dayhoff, our Executive Director of the Commission, to provide some opening comments.
Great. Thank you, Todd. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. We're really pleased to see the level of participation today at just about 200. That far exceeded our expectations, but definitely no complaints here on our end. Actually, I view it as a very promising beginning to this series of webinars related to groundwater renewals. Here at the Commission, we track approval expirations, and we know that we have a wave of renewals coming over the next couple of years. To be honest, it's a little bit daunting. We had a smaller wave of renewals about 10 years ago, which was the first round of renewals, considering when the Commission began issuing groundwater approvals. I think it's safe to say we learned some lessons from those renewals about what we can do better, and we're now putting those lessons to good use. Not only to prepare ourselves to handle the workload, but just as importantly, to prepare you to navigate the renewal process as efficiently as possible. We'll get into a lot more technical details over the course of the next hour about all that, but if I had to sum up our interests and goals, the first one would be that there be no surprises for you. You should know what's coming and what to expect so you can plan for it. And the second would be that probably the biggest challenge we've seen in previous renewals was data gaps. We may all have thought the renewal might go in a certain direction, but the data weren't always necessarily there to support it. So our goal is to help you identify critical data gaps, and even where we can to offer technical assistance to help you plug those gaps. I sincerely, over the future weeks and months, invite you to let me know at any time if you find we're not meeting those goals. But for today, for now, simply thank you again for your interest. I look forward to a productive session, and I'll turn it back over to Todd so we can get going with the information sharing. Thanks again.
Thank you, Drew. So we're going to start our presentation. We're expecting it to be about a 45-minute presentation. Following the presentation, we'll have some time for question and answer. We will review the questions submitted in the chat and provide responses to as many as we have time for. I also wanted to mention that we expect to prepare a frequently asked questions document, an FAQ, which we will also put up on our website shortly after the webinar. So I'll just introduce again Mike Appleby, the Supervisor of Groundwater Project Review, and he will start with our presentation for today.
Thank you, Todd. As he mentioned, my name is Mike Appleby. I am the Groundwater Supervisor. The other person who's going to be speaking here, the other voice that you're going to hear, is Bill Miller. He's also a hydrogeologist with the Groundwater Group. He's been here for several years and has significant experience in working through this and helping with the Public Water Supply Assistance Program, as well as reviewing applications. So a couple of the key personnel that I wanted to point out. You've already heard from Drew and Todd. Also wanted to mention Dave Hackler, who you've all probably corresponded with in some way regarding this webinar series. Dave has been our coordinator for these workshops and this webinar series for a little while now. So if you have any questions regarding access to materials regarding the webinar, or if you have any questions about how to get signed up for the next ones, he's going to be your best contact for that. Bill and I are probably going to be your best contacts for some of the technical material that we talk about today. But then I also wanted to mention Scott McFeeters, who is a hydrogeologist with the Groundwater Group. He has been the primary author on the voluntary action plans that we've been preparing with the Public Water Supply Assistance Program. We'll talk about those action plans in just a little bit of detail today, but not much. But I did want to mention Scott because you won't hear from him today, but you'll hear from him during the next webinar series for the operational testing and monitoring because he's been so heavily involved in the voluntary action plans. So just a brief overview of the webinar in general. Today's session obviously is about the two-step process. So most of what we're going to go over today is going to involve the logistics of submitting a renewal application, as well as going through the Aquifer testing plan or waiver steps to get to that point. There's a few things that we'll talk about that Drew had mentioned regarding the data gaps, as well as some of the online application materials and other resources that are available. The next webinar is going to focus on that operational monitoring and testing, and that's going to be a pretty good follow-up to this because that's going to get into more of the detail about how to fill in some of those data gaps, the difference, what we consider the difference between operational monitoring and operational testing to be, and what that's going to look like for individual projects. We can talk about some of those in specifics and also in some generalities. The final part of the webinar series is the water level monitoring webinar, and that's going to be an interesting one because we're going to talk about logistics of water level monitoring, how to do it, the type of equipment to use, and we also hope to be able to provide a little bit more information on some help that the Commission may be able to provide for that. So you'll have to stay tuned for some of that. So why are we doing this? Well, we've been working with the Public Water Supply Assistance Program since about 2012. The program started with a grant from PADEP. That grant has long since expired, and the Commission realized that there was significant value through all of this, that we wanted to continue this program. So right now it's a self-funded program that we provide with the goal of providing system-specific assistance to public water supply systems, small municipal systems that are eligible for the program. We will come out and meet with them, develop an action plan to help them identify and resolve data gaps. Another aspect of it is the workshops, as well as the webinar series that we're doing right now. So this is our first offering for the Public Water Supply Assistance Program since COVID hit. The last one we had done was in October of 2019 in the town of Binghamton. And while that was helpful, the audience was a lot smaller. So we're very glad to have, at current count, we have 174 participants today. So we are excited about that. We also feel like this was a good opportunity to expand the program beyond just public water suppliers to include all project sponsors. So the advantage of doing this in the COVID world is that we don't have to limit the number of people attending because we can expand it to everyone. So we've got a wide range of people today from all states within the basin, as well as a couple of adjoining states that are probably the consultants with us today. So what prompted some of this and what's going to lead us through each of these series of webinars is a new series of fact sheets that the Commission is developing. The first one was emailed to you with your invite a few days ago. So if you've had a chance to review that, that's great. If not, don't start looking at it right now because we're going to go over that in some detail here today. But take a look at it when this is over. Compare some of your notes to what we've talked about. And this will be something that we'd like you to continue to utilize over the next couple of months. We would ask, though, that you check back to our website fairly often, because there is the chance that some of these will be updated periodically as we learn about new ways to update this, or if there are some things that we can clarify to make things better. So, I suggest maybe this will be good for the next couple of months, and maybe a good time to look back would be around June.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is, as Mike and Todd said, this is Bill Miller. I'm a reviewer with the Groundwater project review section here in the Commission. Let's get into renewals. A lot of text on that slide. I don't typically like to read slides. I think this one's pretty important. This is the first paragraph in the fact sheet. Commission regulations establish project approval terms, including expiration dates and renewal application due dates. You're required to submit information and data for the Commission review to demonstrate continued sustainability of the withdrawal and to evaluate ongoing potential impacts to other users and the environment. Regulation renewal applications need to be submitted to the Commission at least 6 months prior to the expiration date of the approval. This is kind of the what of renewals. This is what we're going to be talking about today and in the following two sessions. What we're going to talk about today is a little bit of the why. Why do we do renewals? An overview of the how and a discussion of the when. When the submittals, what's the timing, those kinds of issues. The two subsequent, as Mike said, the two subsequent webinars will provide a little bit greater detail on that how. How do we generate the data that's needed? How do we identify the data that's needed? And as Mike said, we're trying to reduce any confusion. There's three themes that you're going to hear throughout today and probably the following two webinar sessions. And two of those are contained in this text we just read. And one of those is the three questions that reviewers seek to answer with any review of an application. That's, is the withdrawal sustainable? And an evaluation of potential impacts to other users and to the environment. You're going to see that several times. The other thing is the 6 months prior to expiration date of the approval. We're going to go into that in some detail today. You'll hear it numerous times. And the third that's not really mentioned here on this slide is that part of this process is part of the goal today is to present this information and also to stress that we are available to help project sponsors through this process. We would much rather see people come in, meet, discuss a project, have a clear understanding of what's going to happen and when as we move into these renewals. So why do we do renewals? What's the purpose? Part of it is that standards and site conditions may have changed since the original approval. Approvals now must meet the regulations 80623. And like I said, we're going to evaluate for three things: sustainability, impacts to other users, impacts to the environment. Part of the problem is some of the older testing, the historic testing that may have been done when a well was drilled, probably only addressed the sustainability. Commonly, surface water impacts were not monitored, or impacts to existing groundwater users may not have been monitored. These are the kind of data gaps that we're going to be talking about and trying to address through this process. The other reason we look at renewals is that there are limitations to aquifer testing. You're trying to predict the response to that withdrawal over the term of the approval, which right now is 15 years based on a 3-day test. A 3-day test can't evaluate seasonality or really show any other kind of long-term trends. So we use the data collection during the approval period and as you're coming into the renewal process, it's kind of a check on that original testing. You know, were the conclusions that were drawn from the original testing valid? Have they held up over the time period? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I recently had 2 renewals where they came in with less, a request for less of a withdrawal because the historic testing that was done was not very comprehensive and really overestimated what the yield of those wells were. As those wells went into operation and there's sustained producing conditions, it was obvious that those wells did not have the yield that the original testing seemed to indicate. As a result, the renewals were for a lesser, more appropriate rate. Conversely, I just finished up a review of a project where some of the conditions had changed, and the operational data, the data collected since approval, indicated that perhaps the historical testing that was done at a higher rate than what it was originally approved at may be appropriate. So, you know, there may be the opportunity to increase the withdrawal limit from that supply. And finally, the renewal is part of our active management of water resources. It's periodic check-in on conditions. Like I said, conditions change. It's a good idea to keep track of what's going on. It's kind of similar to, you know, for those in that have wells that require periodic cleaning, you're used to doing well performance tests to kind of track and see what's going on over time. This renewal process is kind of the same thing.
Thanks, Bill. With that, I just wanted to reemphasize briefly about the 6-month requirement. There was a workshop several years ago where one of the things that I emphasized during that was the 6 months, and I said, if there's one thing that you get from this workshop today, it's that the renewal application is due 6 months prior to the expiration. And also that the waiver or offer testing plan that may accompany it does not satisfy that requirement. So this is a very important aspect of it. As long as that renewal application is submitted 6 months prior to expiration, you may continue to operate in accordance with the prior approval until action is taken on the renewal application. I can't stress this enough about how important this is. We're not trying to catch people with this regulation, but we want to make sure that the withdrawals are renewed and it's done in a timely manner. So we'll talk later about some of the timing of all of this, but again, I want to make sure that you get this point. So some of the data gaps that Bill has briefly mentioned, and we'll only get into this very briefly today because we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next webinar series about operational monitoring as testing, is that there are plenty of times when we come across information that may not have been properly assessed or developed or fully considered during the prior approval. So one of the things that we're trying to do with the renewal process and with getting projects to think about the renewal well in advance is to identify what these data gaps are and figure out how to fill them in. So as part of the Public Water Supply Assistance Program, we look to see what data gaps exist for a specific system. We provide a plan for them to then fill in some of those gaps. Now, it's a voluntary thing, so they can choose to do it or not do it, but it's up to them, and we identify those data gaps for them to fill in, hopefully through operational testing and monitoring. We also encourage pre-application meetings so that whether you are involved in the Public Water Supply Assistance Program or not, we will meet with anybody that requests the meeting. We will go over what we know about your project, and you can tell us what you know about your project, and we can provide you with some guidance and assistance on what potential data gaps may be. So the bulk of what we want to talk about today is that this is a two-step process. Step 1 involves an aquifer testing plan or an aquifer testing plan waiver. We commonly just refer to those as waiver requests, and people that have been familiar with the process know that these waivers are something that we're working on pretty often. The step 2 of the process then is the groundwater withdrawal application. We'll talk about the preferred order of some of that in a little bit, as well as the timing. But these are the 2 steps that each project is going to need to go through for each source. So even though there may be a well field determination or something like that where you can say, well, our wells are very close together, so you approved this as a well field before, can I just submit one application? Well, we want to see a waiver or a plan and a groundwater withdrawal application per source because there's specific information in there for each that we need to be able to identify.
Okay, step 1, as Mike was saying, the first step is that aquifer test plan waiver step that we're going to talk about. And again, there's those 3 questions again. It's important to remember as we're going through this, and as you're going through the online applications for the waiver or for the test plan, that all the information that's being requested there goes to answer these 3 questions. We need sufficient information to evaluate these 3 questions, but that's all we need. Part of the rationale or the reason to come in and talk to us, do a pre-application meeting, is to identify those data points that have to be collected to make sure that inappropriate or excess effort is not made to try to answer these questions. And these are all listed in the regulations in 806.12. This is regard to aquifer testing. I would also recommend, if you're interested in a description of what the testing should look like or what kind of information needs to be collected, to look at the aquifer test plan guidance publication as well. We'll have a link to that here later on in the presentation. But that's a good reference of the process and the type of information that's required, and that information can be collected through an aquifer test that's conducted as a result of an approved aquifer test plan, or through operational testing. The important thing is the data, not necessarily how we gather it. Most projects will need an aquifer testing plan or a aquifer testing plan waiver. We're going to talk in a little bit here about there's one other classification or one other way to get through step 1, but it's rather specialized. It's very site specific. Again, it's one where coming in and talking to us prior to going through this process is highly recommended. The bulk of the hydrogeologic evaluation will be completed in this step with either aquifer testing or a waiver. And like I said before, the goal is to answer those 3 questions. Aquifer testing has its place. An aquifer test plan has some benefits. But in general, we're looking for the most efficient way to collect the data that we need. And when I say efficient, that means time, effort, and in a lot of cases, money and cost. So if we can do this efficiently, get the data that we need, everybody benefits.
So there's a couple of ways that projects can meet the aquifer testing requirement contained within 806.12. One is that there was a previously approved aquifer testing plan. They can submit and implement a new aquifer testing plan. That's not the preferred route, but if that's, for some projects, that's what's going to need to happen. Or submittal of an approved aquifer test plan waiver request that Bill was talking about. So the previous testing that comes up, you know, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to probably have some questions about this because this probably isn't very widely known to the consultants and project sponsors that are listening to this. So this is probably an important point. I'm sure that after this is all over, I'll get a couple of calls about how we actually administer some of this. But once a project has met the Aquifer testing requirement once through having an approved plan and test, they don't have to go through that process again. We want to make sure that projects are only going through this significant and thorough evaluation one time. So part of that is that if you had that prior test that was approved by the commission, you're not going to have to do that all over again, which also means that then you wouldn't have to go through the waiver process. So if you've got one of those cases, then you can basically skip over the step one because it's already been done. And you'll move to step two, which is the groundwater withdrawal application. So how do you know if step one has been met? Well, in most cases, I think I would suggest that you contact commission staff for confirmation or evaluation of this. However, as I say that, the second bullet point clearly identifies that there are plenty of approvals that have identified within the docket themselves that the Aquifer testing plan was approved and the test was completed in accordance with that plan. So if that's what it says in your docket, then that's what we're going to go by. But there may be cases where it's not clearly identified that way. So even if it says that, I would still ask you to contact the commission just for confirmation. We'll provide a determination of that to you in writing so that you have it. Because, you know, if I were in project sponsor shoes, I would want to make sure of the process. And so we try to make sure that the projects have that confirmation. They have certainty in this project, like Drew had mentioned earlier. We want to make sure you know what to expect throughout this. So get in touch with us early and contact us with any questions about this. It's also important to note that in 2001, we had our first Aquifer testing guidance approved, and projects that were completed generally under that, you know, there were often some data gaps that would be identified moving forward because there wasn't the emphasis placed on surface water monitoring during that time. There may have been, it may have been done, but since 2007, we've probably taken a more consistent stance with that, and more of those Aquifer testing plans were completed with surface water monitoring or consideration of RTE species. So generally speaking, projects that have done their tests from 2007 on are less likely to have data gaps than projects before that, but that's not a guarantee.
I want to talk a little bit about this option. One of the things, part of the actual application is a section for a hydrogeologic report. Usually that's a report that details the results of testing that was done after a test plan was approved, or it's a reference to the waiver evaluation that was conducted and approved. In this case, since we're not doing a waiver or an Aquifer test plan because there is testing that was completed under an approved plan, we still need to have some additional data in that section of the application. If you remember the rationale or the reason why we do the renewals, it's have conditions changed and or was the original testing conclusions consistent with what we've seen in the operation of the source. So typically, you know, that submittal could be a reference to the original testing and a discussion comparison of what the testing said was going to happen with what actually did happen. So there is some additional information that would have to be required to satisfy that portion of the application. The other impact is, as Mike was saying, sometimes the older testing, even if it was done under an approved plan, still has some data gaps. So there may be some operational testing that's necessary. But that operational testing would then be summarized in the hydrogeologic report, not necessarily as part of a separate waiver request. And some of these are important. You know, going back to that one project that I recently reviewed, it was not done with an approved test, but if it had been, it was an approval that was originally, the testing was done at a higher rate. The approved withdrawal rate was a little bit less because there was a concern for some nearby existing groundwater wells with potential impacts. Well, over the course of that approval, the project sponsor increased the size of their distribution area and eventually provided public water to those facilities with those wells. So that initial concern, that initial limiting factor disappeared over the course of the approval term. And as a result, there may be an opportunity to get a higher withdrawal rate approved for that well. Now, there would have to be some operational testing completed to demonstrate, to fill in some of those data gaps. You know, there wasn't the surface water monitoring that Mike described. You know, there are some data gaps that have to be filled in, but that is a possibility with coming in with the renewal and going through the renewal process, even with the pre-approved plan option.
Okay, thanks, Bill. So if it sounds like we're trying to encourage you to go through the waiver process and use existing data and possibly supplement it with some operational monitoring or testing, that would be accurate because we are. We want, to the maximum extent possible, to be able to utilize the existing data. But if you've gone through our fee schedule, you'll see that there's a note in there that says that if the waiver is denied, a separate fee and aquifer testing plan could be required. So that often scares people from starting to pursue the waiver because they're concerned about having to pay that fee twice. So what we've done is actually gone back and looked at all of the waivers that we have denied in the past. And since about 2012, we have approved more than 90% of them. The waivers that we have denied have been so deficient that they really didn't warrant a whole lot of review because the data just simply wasn't there. Very often what we would get is a paragraph or two that essentially says, please, we've used this for a while, so please renew it. And we're looking to have a little bit more information than that. So sometimes in those cases, we've just converted to an aquifer testing plan. In other cases where there has been some data that gets them started along the path, we've allowed them to collect some additional data. So once you submit it to us, it's not a black box where you input the data and then you get an answer out the other end. We're going to discuss this stuff with you throughout the process. So you have the opportunity to supplement what you've submitted with some other data, provided that it can be given in a reasonable amount of time. So with those 90% that we've approved, it's important to note, though, that there is one large caveat with that not all of those have been approved at the rate that they were originally requesting. So there are times during that review that we realized that the 200,000 gallons a day that the project was requesting really isn't sustainable throughout all conditions or most conditions, like even through a 1 in 10 year drought, and so a lower rate may be necessary. So there are times that it's been requested at a higher rate and we've approved it at a lower rate, but still they're getting through that process and getting to a reasonable quantity of water. So what all does the waiver involve? So I'm not going to get into this in a whole lot of detail today because we're hopeful that there's going to be another webinar series later on that's going to touch on some of this. But the idea behind it is we want to make sure that what gets approved at the end is going to be something that's going to be sustainable and is not going to be something that exists only on paper. So we've talked about paper water. So for some of those of you that have attended those prior workshops, you've heard me mention paper water before, where the quantity of water is known to only exist on that piece of paper and it's never been proven otherwise. Well, that's something we want to make sure is not happening in the future. So if we approve something, we expect that it's going to be a reliable source for you. So there are plenty of times when we go to a project and the first contact we have with them, they'll say, well, we were approved for 200,000 a day, and we know the well can do that, so we should just be approved at that. And, so the first question I'll usually ask somebody is, how do you know that? What data do you have to support it? And I did that fairly recently with a project, and they responded very honestly, and they said, well, we don't really know. We haven't operated it at that rate. The original test that was done really wasn't very good, so we don't know what that well can do. And so they recognized on their own, really, that they needed to collect some additional data to get through this process. So we've been working with them over the last few years to try to accomplish that. And in some cases, that's going to involve completing a full aquifer test, because if you really don't have any data, it's hard to work with something that's not there. So sometimes the easiest and best way to go about it is just that concentrated effort. But in other cases, for projects that have been collecting some of that data for many years, maybe it's just a matter of supplementing what they have. Or maybe it's also thinking about what you need to get out of that source compared to what it was previously approved at. If it was approved at 200,000 before, but you only need 150,000, and that's what it's been doing, and you have the data to support it, then maybe you don't go after that 200,000 value. So we'll get into some of the details about how to identify, how to collect some of that additional data in the next webinar to demonstrate whether or not the prior approval was realistic, whether it was correct, or in some cases, and it doesn't happen too often, but occasionally it does happen, that the approval could be increased moving forward.
Yeah, then the last option, of course, is the aquifer test plan. And like Mike said, if you get the impression that we're trying to answer these questions without having to go through this step, in most cases it's not needed, but there are some where, unfortunately, it is absolutely needed. Usually it's a timing issue. Operational testing, while it can be conducted similar to a constant rate aquifer test, it typically involves collecting data over a longer period of time. An aquifer test itself is a fairly intensive, shorter-term activity. Getting to that point can be a little lengthy with the compiling the aquifer test plan and going through the process and getting that approval. Once that approval has been granted, then usually there's a 2-year time period to do the testing, and sometimes that's necessary. If you think back to what it was in 2018, it was not a good year for testing. And sometimes conditions and situations that are outside of anyone's control can impact the timing on some of these activities. I think that one of the takeaways, or one of the biggest takeaways, is we're going through these three options. For step one is the absolute importance of a pre-application meeting, kind of identifying what you have, coming in, talking to us, sitting down, figuring out where the holes are, what needs to be done to fill those holes. Sometimes, like Mike said, an aquifer test plan is the way to go. A lot of times there's just some holes that need to be filled. So I can't stress enough that as soon as you start thinking, or as soon as you're notified about the expiration of an approval, that you start planning for it and start the conversation with us to move through it. The application, as we talked about, you know, the application does include the submittal of hydrogeologic data, whether through testing, as a result of an Aquifer test plan or operational testing, or simply a reference to a previously approved test with some supplemental data. This is where the 6-month deadline applies, not with the submittal of the waiver or the Aquifer test plan. It's with the application itself. Now, where the what happens when you submit an Aquifer test plan or an Aquifer test plan waiver? Upon approval, there's an application that will be automatically be generated in the online application system, and some of that information will be transferred from the waiver or / plan into the application. We have on occasion, if there's timing concerns, release applications early as we work through the waiver testing process. In that case, there's some information, some of that information that gets transferred from the approved waiver plan that will need to be completed for the application to be released, so you can start working on that. Typically, that's information on the project sponsor, well information, and the groundwater availability analysis. There is some additional information that is required in the application beyond the testing data and that we've been discussing, and that might be a topic for a future webinar series.
All right, so as Bill was alluding to, there is a preferred order for the submittal and completion of these steps. Obviously, step 1 should be done first, but to be a little bit more specific about that, we're looking to get that Aquifer testing plan or waiver request submitted in time for us to actually complete those reviews, get the testing done if necessary, and give you time to complete the groundwater withdrawal application after those items are reviewed and approved. And again, the application would be due 6 months ahead of time. So the timing of all of this, we start sending renewal reminders out 5 years before an approval expires, which to some people seems like an awfully long period of time, but the reality is that we want to give everyone enough time to assess what their process is going to be. So we get a lot of questions about what is actually necessary for each of these projects, and we want to allow time for people to plan for it adequately, because groundwater projects are complicated. And I guarantee, I'll go through this presentation today, and I'll talk about all of the different steps, and then there's going to be people that are going to call me over the next couple of months. They're going to ask about these steps, and the reason for that is it's complicated. It takes some time to work through it. Once you understand it and have gone through it a couple of times, then you kind of get it. But it takes a little bit of time to get used to it. So I understand that there's going to be questions after this that are going to come up, and I would ask that you get in touch with me about all of those questions so that we can help you through the process. So we're sending those email reminders out 5 years ahead of time, and that's really the time that you need to start looking to see what your data gaps may be, what data you have that you can utilize to support a waiver, and get those pre-application meetings set up. And we'll meet with you multiple times throughout this process as it's needed. But what we've often found is that people either get started on the process a little bit too late, or something comes up during the process that doesn't allow them to work through it in the preferred order. So in other words, you may get partway through step 1, be working on the waiver, realize that you needed to collect a little bit more information, but the 6-month deadline is coming up. And that's going to happen before we're going to be able to approve it and open up the application. So what we have is a process we call releasing it. So we can, at any time through this process, whether you're a day ahead of time or 6 months ahead of time, we can release the application from either the groundwater withdrawal, from the Aquifer testing plan or from the waiver. So with this 2-step process, we have actually built the application to be a complementary piece of your plan or waiver, meaning that you normally work through the waiver first, get all the way through that process. Once it's approved, the application is automatically available. But if the timing doesn't exist for that to happen, then we can release the application sooner. So as Bill mentioned, there are 3 things we'd like you to fill out if you need to get the application done more quickly than time would allow to work through the waiver or plan process. And that's who you are, well construction, and groundwater availability, because those 3 pieces are pulled over and will reduce duplication of effort. So here's a couple of resources that you can utilize. I've only included these. I'm not going to talk about them too much because this is going to be shared with you later on. So I'll go through this slide and this slide pretty quickly. You've got some email addresses for us, as well as some of the information that's contained on the fact sheet there. So one last plug for the upcoming webinar series. If you haven't already registered for those, please do so. We think that there's going to be value for each of those. And we're also looking in April of 21 to start talking about Aquifer testing plan waivers in more detail. That's a potential topic, but we'd like to get some input from you. So either through your SurveyMonkey results, send Dave an email requesting different topics, and at the end of all of these webinar series, there will be a specific question about it. So at any point that you think that there's a topic that would benefit you or your clients, please let us know what that may be, and we'll see what we can do about including that in a future webinar. So here's a summary slide of what we've been talking about today. I was expecting to have to talk about this for a little bit of time until some of the questions are put up in the chat, but so far it doesn't look like we have too many. So right now would be a good time if you have some questions to go ahead and add those in, and we'll address those while we're online here. But just as the summary, so the renewal process is a 2-step process. Get the application submitted 6 months prior to expiration to allow continued use of it. We would like you to utilize existing information to the extent possible and collect only the data that you need to move through the process. And start early and coordinate early with commission staff. We do appreciate pre-application meetings. We think it's helpful for us as well as project sponsors, so we are always happy to participate in those. So with that, I'll turn it over to Todd for the question or 2 that we have so far.
Thank you, Mike and Bill, for that presentation. That'll be the end of the presentation portion of this. We're going to transition over to the question and answer. But before I do that, I wanted to just mention, in case anybody needs to drop off early and can't stick around for the Q&A session, we wanted to thank everyone for participating. Dave will be sending out an electronic survey following this webinar to try to get some feedback. And the feedback that you provide us on these types of surveys is really useful in making adjustments and also identifying topics that would be of interest to all of you. Like I mentioned before, there will be a sessions recording of this webinar and an FAQ that we'll make available on our website in the next couple of weeks. And then Mike's already put a plug in, but I'll also repeat that for the next operational monitoring and operational testing webinar, which will be held on Thursday, February 25th. So it'd be great if people can join us for that one. If you haven't already signed up, there's space available. So we have a couple questions coming in, and I think actually maybe I'll just go ahead and cover the first one. And that question is, are registered grandfathered sources going to be required to have an Aquifer or other operational testing done? So in general, sources that have registered and have been issued a grandfathered or are eligible and will be issued a grandfathered certificate are not subject to commission review and approval. Therefore, they're not subject to Aquifer testing or operational testing requirements that we've been describing. However, I want to just mention that that is contingent on that they operate in accordance with their grandfathered certification. There are several actions or changes that the project can initiate that would change that status, and then it would require those grandfathered sources to be subject to review and therefore meeting the requirements for Aquifer testing or some operational testing requirement. Some of those triggers I'll just quickly mention is just like transfer and ownership of the project, increases in withdrawal above that grandfathered determined quantity, and currently the triggers also include if you add a new source to your project. So if you are going to be making changes, it would even be a good idea to contact the commission and ask for a pre-application meeting. We can discuss how changes may affect the grandfathered status of those sources. So I'll move to the next question, and maybe I can ask Mike to answer this. Will or can the SRBC identify data gaps for a water supplier, or is a meeting with SRBC needed to identify gaps?
For projects that are eligible to participate in the Public Water Supply Assistance Program, which are small municipal systems serving 10,000 people or less, the assistance that we offer is to actually come out and do an on-site meeting first, so that we can become a little bit more familiar with the system, visit the well site, and physically, just physically visit the area to see what may be available. One of the things that Dave actually does prior to our meeting is he helps us prepare environmental screening and what we call a regulatory and environmental overview, so that we are prepared to look for wetland features, surface water features, maybe some rare, threatened, or endangered species, that type of thing, so that we're already aware of potential data gaps when we first have that meeting. And then provided that the project wants to continue with that voluntary process, then yes, we will follow up with what we call the voluntary action plan, and that will identify the data gaps as well as some suggested means of filling those data gaps. Now, I emphasize suggested because it is all voluntary. While the renewal itself isn't voluntary, if you want to continue to use it, this program is, and it's at no cost to the public water supplier. So you can choose how you want to use that action plan. If you want to throw it away, you can do that. Or if you want to implement it as written, you can do it. We'd also recommend that as you're implementing an action plan, that your consultant will take a look at the data as it's being collected, if anything is necessary, and talk with us and revise that action plan as needed based on site-specific information and what the results of the monitoring that's being done will provide.
Thanks, Mike. So the next two questions are similar, and I think they could probably be answered at the same time. Maybe I'll ask Mike to answer these. I'll read both of them to you, and then you can provide an answer. So what is the financial cost for completing step 1 and step 2? And the second question is, would like to know general costs to do studies and testing for renewal so we can budget for it. I expect that Mike's going to include in his answer that it is can be highly project specific, but maybe he'll provide some general response, and this would probably also reinforce the benefit of having a pre-application meeting. So.
Yeah, these are questions that are frequently asked to me, and my response is almost always somewhat unfulfilling because my best answer is it depends. And it really is very site-specific on what is actually going to be necessary for each project. So the cost can be really very minimal, or they could be somewhat substantial. So, you know, that's something I think you're going to have to probably talk with us with on a specific basis so that we can give you a better idea of what is necessary, and then you're going to have to speak with your consultant about what that's going to cost on their end, because it's the consulting fees that will probably end up being a significant portion of that. So I think that does stress the need to have that pre-application meeting early on in this process so that you can start the budgeting process and you're aware of what is going to be necessary for your specific project.
Thanks, Mike. We have another question here. It's, we have completed several Aquifer tests for a new source, and the data was submitted to SRBC. Does the SRBC retain the testing plan and data, or does it need to be resubmitted? So I'll ask Mike to answer that one also.
We maintain those records throughout the life of the approval. We have a fairly comprehensive set of electronic records. Everything had been scanned several years ago. So if we have that available, we can provide it to you if you request it. The request needs to come from the project sponsor themselves, and we can provide that data to them. We can go through all the files that we have, and you know, the data that's being reported to us on a quarterly basis with withdrawals, and if you're reporting water level data to us, we maintain that. Some of that withdrawal and water level data is available electronically since about 2007 or so. So we have a fairly good record of that. And that can be made available during this process, and it's actually a great place to start evaluating what the renewal is going to end up looking like.
And if I could add just one thing, as far as if the question's addressing the discussion we had on what needs to be submitted as part of the application, if a testing was done per an approved plan and you're submitting, you don't need to submit the entire hydro report, but you would need to summarize that, talk about the conclusions and the data that supported those conclusions with whatever data that's been collected since then that support or contradict what those conclusions were of the original testing.
Yeah, and I'll just add that that's part of what we do in a pre-application meeting is when those are requested, we take a look at the file, we take a look and see what information we have, and that's some of what we can explain during those pre-application meetings is what the Commission has available already on those projects that are seeking renewal. And so it really is important, and you know, one of the earlier questions was like asking about so they can figure out the general costs and budget for it. And so that's why one of the reasons why we start notifying projects so early, 5 years out, is so that they can contact us, can look at what data they have, what data the Commission has, figure out what steps they're going to need to take, and then they have the time to work it into their budget. What we were seeing in the past, prior to about 2011, a lot of projects were approaching that 6-month renewal deadline and only getting a start at that point, and they were really behind, behind the ball there, and didn't have enough time to collect the information or even budget for it. And so we started doing those automated notifications 5 years out. All right. So here's another question. And it's how can an owner find out who is being emailed the notifications for the project renewal? So just ask Mike to answer that.
Yeah, so I would suggest that you just get in touch with me if you have a question specifically about that project. The way those notices go out is using our database of contacts for a project sponsor. So it's possible that if you're not getting those notices, it's because you're not within our database for one reason or another. And sometimes that's because personnel have changed over the years, and we were not notified about that. So we have an online process now for updating what we call the project contact information. It's the PCI form, and you can find that on our website. So if there's any questions about that, give me a call or get onto our website and fill out that PCI. We're no longer accepting the old Form 72, so if anybody's familiar with that, this new online process has replaced that entirely. And it's something that's going to be a little bit easier for projects to update their own information more frequently, more easily, without having to mail something in to us. They can get in there, update that form at any time, and hit the submit button, and then we make those changes.
Thanks, Mike. I'll just add that we have projects report quarterly data through what we call the monitoring data website. And when the person, the project's person that they've identified as the data entry person, when they log on to the monitoring data website to submit their quarterly data, when they're within that 5-year window, they will start getting a pop-up when they log in, and it will notify them that they have a renewal that's approaching, and they need to click on that pop-up to acknowledge it before they can enter the data. So that's one other person that would be seeing a notification in a routine manner as they approach the deadline for renewal. All right. I don't see any other questions at this time. Anybody has any questions, they can put it into the chat box. All right, I guess we'll just end it here unless there's any other questions that come in. Once again, I just want to thank everyone for attending, and keep an eye out for that email from Dave Hackler for a little short survey that he'll be providing, and he'll provide some information on the next webinar offerings, the next 2 that are in this series. And just remember, we'll also be posting a recording of this webinar along with a FAQ up on our website that you can go and look at it, and that should be available within a couple weeks. And thanks again.